Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for your leadership on this task force. As we're approaching the end of this hearing, I want to just express my appreciation for being included on the task force. This is perhaps the most important responsibility that we have as members of Congress, to make sure that the American people are safe, that our allies are not threatened by terrorism, and in our capacity as members of the Financial Services Committee, obviously stemming the tide of funding for these terrorist organizations is a critical part of that objective. Thank you to our panelists for your expertise and your contributions in this area. And if I could just follow up from my colleague from Maine and his very good line of questioning with respect to Iran, if Dr. Schanzer, if you could just elaborate a little bit, not just about what it would mean to have an additional $120 billion plus in sanctions relief for the GDP of Iran, but specifically if you could elaborate on your testimony, your written testimony, about what can we predict, or what might we foresee in the way of scenarios of channeling of these additional dollars that Iran would accumulate as a result of additional oil sales and banking activities, international banking activities, in the way of prior conduct, specifically Hamas, Hezbollah, and the rebels in Yemen.
Sure. Thank you, Mr. Congressman. So what we have is a pretty prolific country here in terms of terrorism finance. Hundreds of millions of dollars have flowed from Iran to Hamas. We've seen missiles being sent from Bandar Abbas over to Sudan, from Sudan smuggled up into Egypt, and then from there across the Sinai Peninsula into the Gaza Strip. And we're talking about thousands and thousands of those rockets, those 3,500 rockets that were fired into Israel last year. Many of them came from Iran. Iran has also been taking people out of the Gaza Strip, training them on how to manufacture these rockets themselves. So a lot of this is investing in human capital as well. We can expect this to continue. We believe also that some of the tunnel digging equipment that has been used by Hamas has been provided by Iran. So a broad range of activity here, the direct finance as well as the rocket making and the training. Hezbollah, also hundreds of millions of dollars. They right now are currently believed to be in possession of 90,000 rockets, many of them Iran supplied, facing south at Israel right now, and they of course maintain a vast infrastructure across the globe.
So direct question, if I could just interject, direct question is, can we anticipate, if this proposed agreement is finalized, can we anticipate, given the sanctions relief that would be made available to the government in Tehran, a rapid acceleration of this type of financing of these terrorist organizations?
Absolutely, across the board. Houthis, the Assad regime, Hezbollah, Palestinian Islamic Jihad, Hamas, every one of these groups stands to benefit. They are all salivating right now at this idea of a cash infusion.
And I know the other witnesses would like to weigh in. As you weigh in, could you just comment on the earlier testimony that Congress would need to work to backfill the sanctions? What do you mean by that, and how is that even possible given the level of sanctions relief that is contemplated under this agreement?
Congressman, I think one core question for the U.S. government is, how do we treat the Revolutionary Guard of Iran? They are designated under the UN sanctions for nuclear purposes. They're not designated for purposes of terrorism. The Quds Force is, which is a part of the Revolutionary Guard. And so one dimension that you could consider is, what does the U.S. government and Congress consider in terms of the Revolutionary Guard? Why is that important? Because in addition to what Jonathan has laid out with such great articulation, you have the Revolutionary Guard engaged in infrastructure projects, cyber activities against U.S. banks. Keep in mind that the distributed denial of service attacks that have affected U.S. banks, some of them have come from Iran. And you've got major corruption in the context of the mullahs and the ayatollahs running boneyards around the world. And so it's not just all of the very nefarious things that Jonathan's laid out, it's these other systemic things that the Revolutionary Guard and the regime itself can now finance and fund and continue to do. And I think Congress has a responsibility to ensure that those kinds of activities aren't allowed to continue in the wake of a nuclear deal where we may be hamstringing ourselves to use the sanctions regimes that apply to those other activities.
One final question for Mr. Jones. Daesh and ISIL, how effective has American efforts been so far at stopping the flow of financing to ISIL?
I think the evidence is pretty straightforward. They are well-funded. There have been some successful efforts to limit their money from oil smuggling and the money that's coming from refineries, but they are well-funded. They're getting that money centrally and pushing it out to a range of places, including in Anbar province. So I would say across the board, they have sufficient amounts of funding to continue to operate, not just in Iraq and Syria, but to continue to make and establish networks in Afghanistan and Pakistan, where we've seen them, in Libya, in Somalia, and in Yemen, and a range of other locations. So it has not dented their ability to try to expand.
Well, thank you. My time has expired, and I thank you for your testimony, and it just goes to show we have a lot of work ahead of us. Thank you. I yield back.